Miles, thank you for that. All right, guys, we're going to jump into chapter 12 of our book today. So y'all grab your book and then also turn with me to Psalm 130. We're going to talk about hope this morning. First of all, let's read Psalm 130 in the Message. Will somebody read that for us?
Forgiveness is your habit, and that's why you're worshipped. I pray to God, my life of prayers, and wait for what He'll say and do. My life's on the line before God, my Lord, waiting and watching till morning, waiting and watching till morning. O Israel, wait and watch for God. With God's arrival comes love. With God's arrival comes generous redemption. No doubt about it, He'll redeem Israel. Buy back Israel from captivity to sin.
Thank you, Michelle. What did you guys think of Peterson's translation?
Pretty good.
You think so? Why do you think so, Ron?
He pretty well followed about ESV.
Yeah, I think so.
Didn't see, there wasn't any real stretches there.
No, I think this was one of the closer Psalms that we've looked at in terms of how it compares to some of our other translations.
He did a really good job of clarifying some things that uninitiated folks would not, like, oh, if you, O Lord, should mark iniquities. Some people might understand that means if you kept a record of your sins, if you didn't forgive.
Yes.
And I think he did a really good job of taking that to
I agree.
an
I think
understandable level.
this was one where he certainly, it was a translation, but it was for clarity's sake, I think, more than a lot of the other ones that we've looked at. Did y'all see anything else in here that you found helpful in his translation? I really like the bottom has fallen out of my life. Every one of us knows what that feels like. It's a very descriptive phrase. I really like that picture he paints. All right, well, let's jump in here. He opens the chapter with a few thoughts on the reality of suffering. This is page 131. To be human is to be in trouble. That true? Yeah, right? Job says, man is born to trouble as the sparks fly upward, right? In other words, man is always in trouble. This is the way our world works. Suffering is part of what it means to be human. And then he defines suffering in a very interesting way. This is on page 131 as well. He calls it pain plus. Now, let me read his quote and then I'm going to explain what he means. He says, suffering is pain plus physical or emotional pain, plus the awareness that our own worth as people is being threatened. So here's what he's saying. How many of you guys have ever hit your thumb with a hammer? It's not super pleasant, right? Pretty unpleasant sensation. But it's just pain, right? You don't call that suffering. That's not how we refer to hitting your thumb with a hammer. It's just pain. But then let's take another situation. Let's take cancer. If you're diagnosed with cancer. Does having cancer involve pain? Yes. However, that being said, sometimes it's actually less than in terms of acute pain, less than the pain of hitting your thumb with a hammer, right? But we do think of being diagnosed with cancer as suffering. Now, what's the difference? Why is cancer suffering, but hitting your thumb with a hammer isn't?
Suffering usually lasts longer.
Okay, good.
And you have less control.
Yes, I think yes, right? It's not a threat to your existence like cancer is. And then there's also this question, and I think Michelle has hit the nail on the head with the word control. This question comes into our minds when we're diagnosed with something like cancer of, Lord, why have you allowed this to happen? Am I not valuable to you, right? Cancer begins to threaten who we are as people, right? The way we think of ourselves. You don't question your value in God's sight when you hit your thumb with a hammer, right? It's not the same thing. So I love this definition of pain plus. So, yeah.
Legal definition, I mean, Melissa probably can tell us more, but, it's like pain and suffering.
Mm.
We're suing for pain and suffering.
Right. Yeah, Melissa, talk to us about that a little bit, because we will settle damages for pain and suffering. So how does the law think about the word suffering?
Now, I don't know that I've heard that actually broken down. But I do think that it's kind of what we're already discussing, which is one is in the instant and the other is the long-term effect of whatever you're seeking damages for.
Sure.
Is how is this going to affect me personally and perhaps family members as well?
And it is significant, right, that as Ron, I think, is pointing out, if I'm tracking with you, we use both words, which clearly indicates that we see them as different because we don't like to be redundant, right? So it's pain and suffering. These are, in some sense, they may be intertwined, but they're different things. Yes, good. So Psalm 130 helps us deal with suffering.
Also suffering, a big part of suffering is fear.
Yes, yes.
That whole, like if you bang your thumb with a hammer, I'm going to go put ice on it and it's going to be fine. If you have cancer or you lose somebody you love or whatever, there's that whole what now?
Yes. And it's that control aspect that Michelle's talking about. These are things that make us realize we're not in control, right? As to where the hammer just, that's our fault, right? we were in control and we did the thing.
But if you hit your thumb twice, it's suffering.
That's because then you wonder, maybe I really shouldn't be doing this. I'm not very good at this. That's right. So how do we deal with this, right? How do we deal with suffering, those times when the bottom falls out of our lives? This is what Psalm 130 is about. So let me read these first two verses again. The psalmist says, "Help, God, the bottom has fallen out of my life. Master, hear my cry for help. Listen hard, open your ears, listen to my cries for mercy." Now, interestingly, obviously, the psalmist does not try to cover up his suffering, right? Otherwise, we wouldn't be talking about this. He puts it out in the open, which is very different from Southern church culture, isn't it? What do we tend to do with our suffering in Southern church culture? Put it away. I believe it's in this chapter that Peterson says we put it in the closet until it becomes a skeleton, which is a very profound and provocative way of describing what we do. This is true, though.
How are you?
I'm fine, right? This is what we say. So that's one of the things, and here's why we do it. This is page 132. We look at suffering as something slightly embarrassing that must be hushed up and locked in a closet because this sort of thing shouldn't happen to a real person of faith. Now, none of us would say that out loud because we know it sounds stupid, right? But we often behave this way, and we often think this way, that if we were real Christians, this wouldn't be going on in our lives, right? Perhaps this is our fault in some way. Or if we don't go that route, here's the other route. This is also page 132. We talk about it like a puzzle that must be explained and therefore turned over to theologians or philosophers to work out an answer. Who in the Bible does this? Job's friends, right? They come alongside this man who's suffering. Like, let us help you figure this out. We'll untangle this puzzle for you.
One thing that struck me was when I read something on page 132, it says if the psalm did nothing more than that, it would be applied. It's difficult for anyone in our culture who will respect us when we suffer. We live in a time when everyone's goal is to be perpetually healthy and constantly happy. If anyone fails to live up to that, then there's something wrong with it. This book was written in 1980. In 2024, everyone seems to have that's the norm now.
Yes.
It's like, how am I being victimized? Is something wrong? I'm not saying that maybe the church may not be quite that way, but society.
Yes.
So I thought in the last 44 years,
Yes.
a lot has changed. You don't get fine from a lot of people. It's
True.
a laundry list of things, and it's not even things that maybe you can do anything about.
Right.
Or it's a perceived
Yes.
problem.
I'm marginalized and triggered.
And yet the idea remains the same, that because this or that thing is wrong in my life, that somehow I'm out of the norm.
It's almost a badge of honor.
Yes.
Being suffering and being afflicted.
Yes.
So that has kind of flip-flops
Yes.
with the writing of this book.
And I like Ron's word that if suffering has become a badge of honor, well, we only give badges of honor to people who are exceptional in some way. But suffering is not exceptional. It is the norm for the people of God, and actually, just for human beings in general, right? That's what he's saying. So the question becomes, if this is the norm, how do we hold it out publicly, which is what the psalmist is doing, without asking for it to become some sort of badge of honor or give us a special status? Now, part of this is made very clear a few verses into the psalm. Here's what the psalmist says. We get this transition from an acknowledgement of suffering to these words in verses 3 and 4. If you, God, kept records on wrongdoings, who would stand a chance? As it turns out, forgiveness is your habit, and that's why you're worshipped. Let me ask you guys, why, in the middle of a psalm about suffering, do we talk about sin? Why is it there?
But we feel like suffering is justified and honored.
Okay. So, okay, good. So a part of it is we have this sort of instinct, maybe we would call it, that when we suffer, it's punishment for sin, okay? Why else do we talk about sin?
Instinct for some of us were raised in churches that taught us
Okay,
that.
that's true. We've been taught this, right?
Well, some people know that they've actually done something that caused this suffering. I mean, we don't want anyone to suffer, but you're like, you know what? Consequences. If you do
Yes.
that's going to happen.
Yes.
Even though it is suffering, and we can be forgiven of it, and we can have people that try to help you and all those things.
Yes.
Still.
So sometimes, is suffering the result of our sin? Yes. So here's, or someone else's sin. That's exactly right. Yes. Yeah, and so there, Ron actually makes a great point here that very often, in fact, I would suggest most of the time, and this is one of the lessons from Job, you and I can't untangle this. Like, there are times when we can see cause and effect. Here's my sin, here's how I'm suffering because of it. But very often, this is so complicated that you and I are not capable of untangling it. We know that suffering is a result of sin, but we can't always say what sin or whose sin, right? But we have to acknowledge, and that's why the psalmist does, that sin plays an important role in our suffering. But his point is, even when suffering is our fault, the Bible encourages us to acknowledge it, get it out in the open. Why? This is verse 4, because God is a forgiving God. And since He's forgiving, what are we to do? What does it say? We're to worship. So, far from detracting from the glory of God when we put our suffering out in the open and our sin out in the open, the psalmist says this brings glory to God because it should cause us and the people around us to whom we acknowledge it to worship because God is forgiving and gracious. So Psalm 130 is already teaching us a very different way. It's teaching us to acknowledge our suffering openly. And I love this quote, when we acknowledge it, to think more of the depth of God than the depth of your cry. The worst thing that can happen to a man is to have no God to cry to out of the depth, right? He's saying we are an example to our friends and neighbors and coworkers when we cry out to God from the midst of our suffering, because it's teaching them that we do have a God to cry to, and He's the kind of God who listens from that place. So what we ought to teach our culture here by example is, on the one hand, don't bury your suffering, which is that's Southern culture. That's what we do. But as Ron pointed out, the other thing that we have to teach our culture is that we don't exalt our suffering as holy. It doesn't make us special. It doesn't give us some sort of special status or badge of honor. Instead, the psalm is encouraging us to take our suffering to God, who, first of all, actually cares, and second of all, can actually fix the pain and the hurt that we go through. So page 134, Peterson says, we don't take any of those paths that the world offers. None of that. The suffering is held up and proclaimed and prayed. The second important thing Psalm 130 does, he says, is to immerse the suffering in God. All the suffering is spoken in the form of prayer, which means that God is taken seriously as a personal and concerned being. I want to talk about this piece for a second, about God being personal and concerned. I think this is important. He's highlighting what should be the natural growth of a disciple, the natural progress on this road of discipleship. Here's how I think about it. My boys have learned as they've grown that there are things that mom and dad can do that they can't. Okay, sometimes they're too short to reach things that we can reach. We can lift things that are too heavy for them. We can help with things that they're not coordinated enough to do yet. They've also learned that mom and dad care about them. Okay, so they've put 3 pieces of information together that I think we need to put together as well. First of all, they're aware to some extent of their inability. I can't reach that, I can't lift that, I can't do this. Okay, they understand that they can't do everything. They're also aware of mom and dad's ability. We are able to do a lot of things they are not able to do. And third, they're aware that we care about them, that if they bring these things to us, we will help them where they are unable. We need to know those 3 things. We really need to know that we are limited creatures who often are unable to change things and to do things. I mean, look, last night is an indicator to all of us that there's some inability on our part, right? We may not like the situation in our country, but there are certain things that we cannot do to change it, right? There are certain things we can do, certainly, but we're also unable to deal with a lot of this stuff. But we need to know that where we have inability, God has ability. He is able to do all kinds of things that you and I cannot. And best of all, He cares enough to help us, right? And so just as my boys have grown in this knowledge that they're unable, we're able, and we care, we should grow in that knowledge as we walk with the Lord. And so I'd like to suggest to you this morning that the longer you walk with the Lord, the more you should ask Him for help, not less. As you grow in discipleship, you shouldn't need the Lord less. You should be more aware of your need for Him, right? And so a question for us to consider this morning and this week is, are we aware of our inability, of the Lord's ability, and of His desire to help us? And is that evident in your life by how much you ask for help from the Lord, how much you pray?
Do you think some of this suffering will come through the process of sanctification?
Oh, for sure. That's what it's used for, right? And not just used for, but I like your phrasing, that it comes through that process. That, to use an example I'm fond of, if you're going to get, let's use Eli, Ron and Michelle's son, who's on the rowing team at the Coast Guard Academy. Is there a certain amount of suffering involved in rowing practice? Yes.
To hear Eli say yes.
Yes. It's a very painful thing, but the only way he's going to get more fit is by going through that suffering, right? And the same is true for us. There are things that have to be scraped and shaved and cut off of us to make us more like Christ, and that's very often a painful process, but it's good for us, right? In the same way that enduring the difficulty breathing and the high heart rate and the sweating that's involved in rowing is good for you.
What's the difference between being punished for your sin or disciplined for your holiness?
Yes. The Bible puts it so well and so briefly, the Lord disciplines those He loves, right? Something we need to remember when we are suffering, for sure. All right, I love the last part of the psalm. It holds up these 2 great realities, Psalm 130 does, that suffering is real and God is real. Now, we feel those realities in tension, don't we? There's some part of us that says if God is real and He's good, we shouldn't suffer, but we're presented with both truths. God is real and we suffer. So how do we live in the tension? Here's what Peterson says. The program is given in 2 words, wait and watch. These words are found in verses 5 and 6. Here's what it says. I pray to God, my life a prayer, and wait for what He'll say and do. My life's on the line before God, my Lord, waiting and watching till morning, waiting and watching till morning. And Peterson says these 2 words, wait and watch, add up to hope. I love this little word math equation. I hated them in school, but this is a good one. What do these words, wait and watch, what job do they refer to? A watchman. Okay, what does a night watchman do? Okay, good. He waits and watches. Why?
For the morning coming.
Okay, good. So he's waiting and watching for morning. And one other thing.
Makes everything okay.
Okay, good. So he's waiting and watching for danger, right? Because danger very often comes in the night.
Fire.
Yeah, fire, good.
Fire and, bacon.
Yeah, that's right. Enemies maybe that might come. So here's what Peterson says. I love this, 136. A watchman is an important person, but doesn't do very much, right? Peterson actually worked as a night watchman in a building, was in New York, I think it was in New York, and he talks about how he would sit at the desk all night, right, and he would interact with a few people who came in, whatever. He was like a unglorified receptionist, and for a little bit he'd work the elevator, but he did, in the grand scheme of the operation of the building, he did next to nothing, right? It was the owner and operator of the building who really moved the needle, who was the important person. And so his conclusion from this, page 138, the psalmists and the Christians waiting and watching, that is hoping, is based on the conviction that God is actively involved in His creation and vigorously at work in redemption. In other words, you and I are encouraged to wait and watch, but as watchmen, do we, in the grand scheme of things, we do very much? No. Who's the active agent? God. He's the owner of the building, so to speak. It's not that we do nothing. It's that we trust God to be at work in us and through us and around us, right? He's the one who's really moving the needle. Miles shared with us a minute ago about these folks who the Lord has been working on in his life. Now, did Miles do something? Yes, right? But could Miles on his own get any of these people in church or change their hearts? No shot. No way. The Lord has to have gone before him. The Lord has to go with him. The Lord's got to come after him, right? It's the only way that this is going to work. So, page 138, this is my favorite quote from the chapter. It is the opposite of desperate and panicky manipulations of scurrying and worrying. Do y'all ever scurry and worry? Those are really good terms. Yeah, Ron had a flood in his house, and I imagine there was some scurrying and worrying, huh? So I imagine if y'all were like me, last night after about 5:30 or so, you spent a lot of time in front of your TV and on your phone watching what was going on in our country. I watched and read hundreds of reactions from people around the country, and generally speaking, I think these two words are good descriptors of what we saw. There's a lot of scurrying and a lot of worrying, right? Now, y'all please don't misunderstand me. What happened yesterday is very serious, and there's a lot of activity that was necessitated by what happened. But I think that you and I, as Christians, living in a cultural moment like this, have something that we must offer to our world, right? I was talking with Wes before we got started this morning, and I said, when you realize that less people are going to church than have been going in a long, long time. Church membership is at a historic low in the United States. When you realize that less people are believers than in a long, long time, the things that happened yesterday, and I'm not just talking about the shooting, I'm talking about the reactions as well, make sense. Because if we believe that the highest power in the world is the President of the United States, that everything in our lives hinges on an election and elected officials, the things that happened yesterday make a lot of sense. These are natural reactions if that is your belief system, but you and I hope, don't believe that, right? And so for us as Christians, when people look at us in a moment like this, they should not see scurry and worry. That doesn't mean they shouldn't see care. We do care. We know the Lord works through people. We know elections matter. But we also know He's the one on the throne, right? And so when they look at us, they shouldn't see scurry and worry. They should see almost a disturbing level of peace, right? That this matters, that we're concerned about this, but that our reaction is different. And so kind of my challenge to y'all this week, and I'm talking to myself as well, is take this psalm to heart. It's offering us a better way. When we're interacting and following this situation over the coming weeks, take these 3 terms, paste them on your mirror. Wait, watch, hope, right? Not scurry and worry. Wait, watch, hope. This is a better way. We need to take this to heart, what he's saying here. And I'll read this quote before we do a little question and answer. This was profound, page 139. So he's holding up this metaphor of, when water is still, it doesn't have as much of a smell, but if we shake it, that fragrance comes out. So here's what he says. The same shaking that makes fetid water stink makes perfume issue a more pleasant odor. Okay, things got shaken yesterday.
That's a quote from Augustine.
Is it? It's good. We had a shakeup.
The city of God.
It's from the city of God. That's awesome. So the question is, now that all of us have been thoroughly shaken, what kind of odor are you going to give off, right? When you come to these moments of trial, it reveals what's going on in your heart. And so that will be a question that will be answered in our lives over the coming days for sure. All right, y'all, we got about 5 or 6 minutes. What in this chapter stood out to you that either you want to talk more about or I haven't talked about yet? What questions do y'all have?
Well, I just think when you talk about wait, watch, hope in terms of what happened yesterday, what we're hoping for, what we're waiting for is the coming of an eternal government. And so if we let ourselves be overly rattled by things that are happening politically, again, not that it wasn't awful, not that it wasn't scary, but I just keep reminding people, and sometimes people don't like to hear it, there's one eternal government, there's one government that's going to stand forever, and it's not this one.
It's not this one, that's right.
And so you have to keep that perspective that as big as that was, as bad as that is, it's not, in the grand scheme, it's small.
That, again, we're not, to go back to Ron's earlier comment about suffering and a badge of honor, this is not unique, particularly in the history of the world, or actually in the history of our country. And to the extent that it's not unique, we shouldn't allow it to disturb us so much, right? This is not the government that will last forever. There's only one of those. Ron?
Yeah, I had the last verse, translation, it says that he will redeem Israel from all his iniquities. I'm confused by it.
Good. Explain your confusion so I make sure I answer it.
Well, I guess he will redeem Israel. Is that the new Israel we're talking about, or from all his iniquities? His being God.
Correct. So it must be Israel's. Good. So the question is, how does this work, right? What's he saying? And I think we can talk about it in at least 3 ways. The first being the immediate application to the nation of Israel, right? Their history is a history of exile and redemption. So this not only was fulfilled once, but many times over, right? And then I think we can think about it in some sense in terms of what Paul talks about in Romans where there's going to be a large portion of Israelites, Jews, right, who come to faith in Jesus and are redeemed from their iniquities. And I think we are certainly invited to apply this to ourselves, that we are, as the church, the new Israel. And do we have a lot of iniquities? Right. And He redeems us from these, right? And so I think this is not an either-or sort of situation. It's a both and we're invited to apply this in any number of ways to our own lives and to the world around us. It's a good question, though. What else, y'all? Let's take one more question before we wrap up, or comment. Michelle?
Well, I think a lot of times when we're going through something, we say, why me?
Mm.
And I think, well, why not me?
Why not
I think
me?
the better thing, because Jesus suffered.
Yes.
Suffered more than any of us have ever even could imagine. So if He went through it,
Mm.
why not me?
Yes.
We're not special in that way. Everyone goes through something.
Yes.
The suffering is different. Still suffering.
Yes. And Jesus, He tells His disciples, and by extension us, servant is not greater than his master. If they hated me, they will hate you. If they persecuted me, they will persecute you, right? And perplexingly and disturbingly, I believe it's Paul who says that we fill up the sufferings or complete the sufferings of Jesus. Now, we don't have time for that today, but that's a profound thought, right? That to some extent, when we suffer, we complete the sufferings of Christ. Like I said, that's a long discussion, but it's true. And if Jesus suffered, we will too. Why not us, right? All right, y'all, let's pray, and we're going to get ready for worship. Father, I thank you for psalms like this that are there for us when we suffer, that remind us of the truth that suffering is part and parcel of what it means to be human in a fallen world. And Lord, I ask that you would help us to suffer well, that we would not hide it, but we would also not glorify it. Instead, I ask that we would prayerfully give it to you and worship you both in the midst of it and when you bring us out of it. In this cultural moment, as our nation suffers, would you help us as Christians, as a church, to hold up a better way, to hold up the waiting and watching that comes to hoping in Jesus. We make this prayer in His name. Amen. Thanks, guys.